Thank you very much, Nick and Frank, and it's an honor to be here. And this is really a new concept. Beside what happens in viruses, there is a real impact in cardiovascular diseases. But just to put everybody in the same page, I would like to talk a little bit about the influenza history, because influenza is the most common viruses. And the first reference starts with Hippocrates in 412 before Christ. The name influenza comes from Italian Salvatore. It means the influence. And some references say that about astrological unfavorable influence, like the period of cold. The first pandemic happened in Russia in 1889 with the H3N8 virus. Since then, four big pandemics. In 1918, H1N1, with 5 million deaths. In 57, with the H2N2, 4 million deaths. In 68, the H3N2, 2 million deaths. And 2009, the H1N1, with between 152,000 to 575,000 deaths. You may all remember this 2009 pandemic. And this picture is what was done at that time. You see how large it was, infirmary for influenza is a real picture. The World Health Organization estimating that flu affects 5 to 15% of the world population, with almost 3,000 to 6,000 deaths every year. But when there is a good match, vaccination reduces 40 to 60% the need for emergency care or doctor appointment. A good match is because the virus can shift, that is a complete change in the hemagglutinin and neuraminidase, or drift. There is a small change. And we can see what is a drift and a shift. When there is a shift, the vaccine effectiveness is very low. And you saw that influenza A is the most common because there is an aviary reservoir and adaptation to pig, human, horses, and other mammals. All the pandemics occurred with influenza A. Influenza B, it's almost only happens in humans and no adaptation with animal. So it's very unusual to expect an influenza B pandemic. Besides the benefits of vaccination and beside the lung diseases that influenza may cause, there is also some cardiovascular diseases caused by virus. And I will show more about influenza that is the most known. So you may all remember that in 1918, there was one important paper with 364 hospitalizations for acute MI. And the risk of admission during the interval risk were 6.05. They considered the zero moment of the risk interval, the positive detection of the laboratory positive detection of influenza. And then, during this period, the risk for admitting for acute MI was 6 times more. And interesting, there was no increase after day 7. We can see here that from day 1 to 3 and 4 to 7, increase in admissions, and it's amazing that after day 8, there was not. This may be related, and we all are each time more aware about how inflammation is deleterious for atherosclerosis. So inflammation may lead to rupture of the plaque and the occurrence of acute MI. And there is an inflammatory release of cytokines, a prothrombotic state, then plaque destabilization, thrombosis, immune complex deposition, and increased macrophage circulation, all that leading to acute MI, STEMI or NSTEMI. And we can also think about type 2 myocardial infarction because of the increase in the metabolism. And you may all remember the IMI trial presented in the ASC Congress and then published in circulation that showed that 2,500 patients were followed and vaccinated after a myocardial infarction. And the patients were followed for 1 year. The initial recruitment was expected to be 4,400, but it happened exactly during the pandemic for COVID-19. And what they show is that vaccinating patients after a myocardial infarction, any moment of the year, was related to a relative reduction of 41% in cardiovascular death and in all-cause death in the primary outcome, and more important, 41% reduction in cardiovascular death. It was not possible to know if there was another myocardial infarction or a stent thrombosis because the patients didn't come to the emergency department. Many patients died at home, as in this and many other diseases. This makes us think that maybe that Netter painting that showed that after a meal, carrying weight, doing effort, and in smoking, and the cold was a trigger to myocardial infarction or angina. And I would say maybe the cold is not the case. Maybe influenza must be the case. What we know about heart failure and influenza vaccination. Many evidences appeared after the year of 2000, and this is from 2019, 4 communities in the United States. Here we can see the influenza seasons, and we can see in blue the visits for influenza, and we can see in black hospitalizations for heart failure. was almost 5,000 adults, and this led to further investigations. And this was one of them. It was retrospective. It's the influenza vaccine, the effect in heart failure, in a Danish nationwide cohort study, with the objective was to investigate if flu vaccination was association to reduce in cardiovascular deaths and all-cause deaths in patients with heart failure. And they showed that in 134,000 patients, all-cause deaths was reduced with any number of vaccinations, but more than 3 vaccinations in the period study that was from 2003 and 2015, more than 3 was related to a reduction in 28% of all-cause death and the same amount in cardiovascular death. This was retrospective, but we have prospective studies like this one that was published more recently. Patients with 5,000 patients with any kind of heart failure were randomly assigned 1-to-1 to influenza vaccine or placebo. And what was found? Patients, the study was divided between the number of events during peak influenza and outside the peak influenza. All-cause deaths were in patients with heart failure was very, about 20% lower than patients with placebo, but only during the peak influenza circulation period. In the outside peak influenza, there was no relation. But pneumonia was not also was less occurring, about 50% during the influenza period, but also outside. If we compare drugs with vaccination, the benefit is very similar. But not only influenza. We saw that also in COVID. This was published about 90,000 patients with COVID and 350 matched control. What saw that including day 0, that was the day of the exposure, the odd risk for acute MI was 6.61. Interesting, it was very similar to that study, to that previous study. Vaccination for herpes. This is a meta-analysis showing a reduction in 30% in cardiovascular event and 34% in vaccination after herpes zoster. Even the rate of acute myocardial infarction after herpes zoster was 1.68 more than patients without it. But of course, the time after the diseases lowered the benefit. We are doing right now a study about the prevalence of influenza in ED facilities and the impact in cardiovascular morbidity. But we aimed the wrong target because we planned to see from 2019 to 2020. So we couldn't start because if we take a look at flu in general population, although 617 patients with flu syndrome, we had a positive flu A or flu B in only 11 patients. There are many other viruses circulating right now, like beside COVID, Epstein-Barr, rhinovirus, and also pertussis. And we also couldn't relate flu with cardiac or lung worsening because we had no patients until now with flu, with positive flu. I'd like to finish with this study that is made from a database from 2008 to 2019. That means 11 years, almost 2,000 patients with a cardiovascular event and vaccination within 12 months versus non-vaccinated. So they studied 120-day post-flu vaccine and after that and before that. And the acute cardiovascular event was acute MI, unstable angina, acute heart failure, stroke, ischemic transitory stroke or limb ischemia. The population was divided between high risk and low risk, and the patients with high risk had the higher protection. In general, cardiovascular protection on day 15 to 28 was related to almost 30% less events, and the greater protective effect was higher in patients above 65 years. We can see that any cardiovascular event less 28, myocardial infarction less 40%, unstable angina less 21%, acute left ventricular heart failure less 24%, stroke less 30%, transit ischemic attack less 18%. So in summary, viruses are a trigger for acute myocardial infarction and death for acute myocardial infarction, decompensation and death in heart failure patients, increase in cerebrovascular events. Influenza vaccination protects against the risk of these complications, mainly during the influenza seasons. So all patients with heart failure at least and other cardiovascular disease should be vaccinated. Thank you for your attention.
Dr. De Soma has one short question.
Very short. Fantastic, Mucio. Really enjoyed a lot. My question is, okay, for tomorrow a patient coming with the influenza in the emergency room, how can you detect between many patients we send at home, the patients going to have myocardial infarction? Did you have any suggestion to detect this one?
Well, I think the most important is to ask if the patient was vaccinated or not. This make the patient go in two different ways. But I think we need to be closer and look closer at patients with cardiovascular risk. Not all the patients with influenza, but the ones with many risk factors.
I just one final question, if I may. So the evidence looks quite clear that if you have cardiovascular disease, then vaccination is good for you, and it's part of our guideline now to do that. for influenza. We've just been through the COVID pandemic, and there's a lot of research suggesting that you're more likely to have had a myocardial infarct if you had COVID than if you had been vaccinated. There's also a kind of drive, after all the industry investment in vaccination here, to continue to give COVID vaccines in the future. And so my question is whether you think there will be a role for ongoing vaccination for COVID in vulnerable high-risk patients who may be at risk of cardiovascular events or not.
Well, I'm not infectious disease specialist, but what was discussed is that COVID-19 or SARS-CoV-2 will behave in the next years of the next decades as a common flu. We see each time patients with less severe diseases and dying with a much less rate than before. I think that vaccination makes all the sense.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much for that fascinating presentation.